How and whether you should handle your pet reptile is a hotly debated subject. But no matter where you stand, it's an important issue to explore. What is choice-based handling, and should you practice it? Is it the only ethical method of interacting with captive snakes? What are the pros and cons of choice-based interactions for both the animal and the caretaker? And what if I said that you must handle your snake, whether they like it or not? Let's slither on into it and get controversial. This episode is going to dive into a topic that can be quite divisive in the reptile community. My goal is to explore and evaluate the various methods and viewpoints regarding handling pet snakes so you can make informed decisions for yourself. Whatever you think of the various opinions or my personal stance on the matter, the tenet of this channel is always that you be unequivocally focused on the health and well-being of your animal. As I've said many times, there's no single right way to keep snakes as pets, except that their welfare remains priority number one. The rest, whether fortunately or unfortunately, is subjective and left up to interpretation. Doing our best is the best we can do. No one is perfect or has all the answers, but everyone has the opportunity to grow, learn, and try to do better than the day before. Some things we review today may sway you to one direction or the other, or perhaps you already stand staunchly in one camp, but either way, it's never a bad thing to review different angles. So let's try to look at this as a scientific study as opposed to a political argument. Not so long ago, there was barely a reptile community at all. We've gained so much more knowledge about these animals and how to keep them healthy in captivity since I got my first snake back in the 90s, and there's so much more we're learning every day. So keep in mind that although there are a lot of strong opinions about the way we do it, there are no one-size-fits-all rules. And even the experts don't know everything. Oh, and for the record, I do not count myself as an expert. And one last note, I'm going to use snake as my noun moving forward, but these concepts can be applied to reptiles and animals in general. So what is choice-based handling and care? Choice-based handling refers to the practice of allowing the snake to choose when and if it gets handled. This means that if you offer the opportunity to be held or touched, but they don't take that opportunity, then you don't force them to do so. Because these animals are not naturally conditioned to interact with humans, allowing them to control their engagement with us reduces the amount of stress we cause them, and therefore is proclaimed as the most ethical method of engaging with them. The argument for this practice is that it improves their quality of life and longevity, because just like for humans, stress can negatively impact their overall health. Anyone who's watched my previous episodes knows I have a massive amount of respect for and repeatedly reference the work of Lori Tarini, an animal behaviorist who is one of the most prominent proponents of choice-based interaction. She uses some awesome training methods to reinforce learned behaviors and incentivize choice-based socialization with snakes. She advocates techniques I've recommended in my own videos, like patience, observational presence without physical engagement, and positive association reinforcement. She advocates what she calls fear-free interaction and LIMA, or least intrusive, minimally aversive principles, which offer them as much choice as is safe or possible. If they retreat, you leave them alone. You leave the enclosure door open to allow the snake to come out on its own. You handle it as little as possible unless the animal actually touches you, and otherwise use a hook or food as motivation to get them to go where you want them to go. Choice-based care, or choice-rich life, refers to more of the habitat the animal is kept in. Do they have the choice to exercise their species-specific behaviors? This also affects their physical and mental health. For example, if they're a burrowing snake, but you don't provide a deep layer of substrate in their enclosure, you're not giving them the choice to do what they've evolved to do. Choice-based care is, to me, indistinguishable with basic welfare. Now, the level to which you provide this is a hotly debated topic, which we will not be discussing today. I mentioned choice-based care because both of these concepts feed off of each other. If your snake is not allowed the choice to perform its natural behaviors, well, it will most likely not choose to be handled either. Fundamentally, I believe the arguments for choice-based handling and Lori Termini's methods are extremely sound. Do I exclusively practice them? No, I don't. But we'll get into my personal practices later. First, let's just talk about the basic pros and cons of choice-based handling. Okay, where are you going? So what are the pros to practicing choice-based handling for the snake? Number one, who actually likes stress? Defense and fear responses flood their system with cortisol and other stress hormones, which can disrupt the body's processes if repeated too often. And this goes for any animal, not just snakes. Number two, free will. It can go about its business as it sees fit. Not being forced into being handled means they don't need to adjust to anything out of their comfort zone. And number three, less chance of injury incurred by human hands. I'd never hurt you. Pros for the person. It's pretty fulfilling to know that your snake isn't stressed. Two, you're rewarded with the knowledge that your snake trusts you enough to engage with you of its own accord. It's like feeling that they like you. There's a level of anthropomorphism here, but it's not the harmful kind. The moments when my snakes touch me instead of vice versa never ceases to warm my heart. You have a relationship with them. And number three, you are much less likely to receive a defensive bite or get musked on, which is never pleasant. So what are the cons of choice-based handling for the snake? None. There's nothing negative about being given the ability to choose how you live your life, regardless of your species. There is a caveat to this, which we'll get into in a minute, but intrinsically, there aren't any cons for the snake with this method. What are the cons for the person? Inevitably, you'll get a lot less handling time with your snake. Snakes are individuals with unique personalities, but more often than not, they're not outgoing social creatures like dogs and cats. So if you practice choice-based handling, your interactions are going to happen less frequently, if at all. You may never end up handling your snake if you opt for strictly choice-based interaction. For example, Dumeril's boas are ambush predators, known for their practice of sitting in wait beneath leaf litter and foliage for days, if not weeks at a time, until their prey comes by. Olorin is a sweet, curious boy when he's out of his enclosure or when there are new items for him to investigate, but otherwise, he rarely comes out from underneath the substrate in his enclosure and sits still most of the time. I've given him plenty of opportunities, but he's just not really that guy, at least not right now. It can totally change, so I'm never going to give up trying. In contrast, Anu is extremely active and interested in what's going on outside of her enclosure and will often come out almost as soon as I open her doors if she's not at the doors already. So I end up interacting with her a lot more than Olorin on the whole. Time investment. You're going to need to spend a lot more of your time with or just around your animals in order to get them to a place where they choose to interact with you. You may need to leave the doors of their enclosure open for hours before they come out, if they do at all. And there are issues with that because if the location isn't secure and escape-proof, then you must be present and supervising the whole time in order to ensure their safety. The more snakes you have, the more time you'll need to spend with each individual just to get the opportunity to possibly handle them. I have 9 snakes, and there are plenty of people who have more than that. So if each snake took even an hour just to engage with me, well, you do the math. That being said, I don't handle my snakes every day, but it's worth mentioning and is one of the reasons I don't want to acquire any more snakes right now. Depending on the species of snake you have, their activity levels may not align with yours, meaning that if you have time to work with them at night after your day is done, but you have a diurnal snake, it's possible that it'll be sleeping and not motivated to interact then. And vice versa, if your available time is during the day, but your snake is nocturnal, it's less likely to choose to come to you then. Let's be clear, all the cons are human-centric. It's only a con if you're counting your desires as more important than the animals. But I do have to point out that we don't keep these animals for their sake, do we? Be honest. Why do you have a pet snake? Why does anyone have a pet? The reality is we are selfish creatures and we want the comfort and pleasure of what they offer us. However, we can absolutely still prioritize their health in such a way that our desires don't cause lasting damage or harm. And I say lasting because the fact is it's impossible to eliminate fear or stress entirely when keeping these animals in captivity, even if we practice choice-based interactions 100% of the time. Stick with me here. Some short-term stress is inevitable and isn't inherently animal cruelty. Think about it this way. If your snake never feels any stress, ever, well, damn, that snake has a cushy life. Do you think that in the wild, these animals never feel stressed out? Now, I'm not at all saying that because they'd experienced stress in the wild that we should be insensitive to their stress levels in our care. I'm saying that stress is a natural part of life, and what we should be doing is minimizing it as much as we can. There are two kinds of stress, short-term and long-term. Both can have negative effects on their health, but let's break this down a bit here. If you pick up a snake against its will, especially in a predatory or forceful way, if you don't pay attention to body language, if you don't spend time building any trust with it through repetition and behavioral communication techniques, then when you pick it up for a moment, it will fear for its life. Now, likely that stress will go away pretty swiftly if you understand how to handle the snake properly and make it feel comfortable. That's short-term stress. And if you've worked with it enough that it knows and trusts you, if you practice things like tap, touch, or hook training and give it the opportunity to learn what to expect from that, the short-term stress will happen less frequently and for less periods of time, and it won't do lasting damage to the animal's health. Long-term stress comes from things like poor environmental conditions, like lack of enrichment, light, space to move, or being scared for its life too frequently. That kind of stress will most certainly affect the long-term health of the animal as well as its behavior. Snakes suffering from constant stress are not going to be in a place for productive learning either. So not only is it not going to choose to engage with you, it will probably respond poorly to trust building and training techniques as well. If your snake is consistently stressed by the presence of people walking by its enclosure, for example, and you have it in a highly trafficked area of your home, you're causing it long-term stress. You have a couple of options here to reduce the long-term stress in that situation. You could cover the enclosure with paper or put it somewhere where the snake won't be able to see movement anymore. The problem with that method is that when you need to check on the animal or do maintenance, it hasn't learned that the movement or presence of people is not, in fact, going to hurt it. So the stress it feels will still happen strongly whenever you interact. A better option might be to just minimize exposure. Instead of moving the enclosure entirely, cover it for half the day and uncover it for the other half of the day. It's an example of systematic desensitization, which is where a fear response is extinguished over time by gradually exposing it to the stimulus that causes it fear. This allows its nervous system a break, but still exposes it to the stressor long enough that it has a chance to learn that it doesn't actually require such a dramatic reaction. You can apply this to handling your snake as well, as long as you're doing it properly. It's up to us as compassionate caretakers to figure out what's best for the particular animal and situation. The goal should always be to minimize stress, but we'll never be able to remove it altogether. Anyone who thinks that practicing strictly choice-based handling is giving their snakes a completely stress-free life needs to acknowledge that. Before I get into what will probably get me some interesting comments, I wanted to take a second and remind you that if you find this content at all engaging, if it makes you think and feel and helps you evaluate your relationships with your animals and yourself, please take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already and hit that like button. If you don't like it, then, well, I'm surprised you made it this far, but you have the choice to watch something else, and I respect that. It does take a huge amount of time and effort, so if you do think it's worth supporting, hop on over to Patreon and go the extra mile to help me continue to create content that helps us be better educated, be better humans, and more empathetic caretakers for these amazing animals. What are you doing? I agree with the practice of choice-based interactions, especially if you're spending time fostering trust and incorporating motivational training methods. However, I'm going to make the argument that you have a responsibility to handle your snakes regularly, whether they like it or not. Hear me out. Perhaps you have a snake that, despite your best efforts, isn't choosing to engage with your touch of its own accord. So you leave it alone, you feed it, you enjoy looking at it. Time goes by, and one day you notice that it's not looking so good or it's refusing food. Reptiles can be sick for a long time before they show noticeable behavioral signs of illness. It's your responsibility to do regular welfare checks. And in order to do that, you need to be able to handle your snake safely and ideally without causing it excessive stress. You need to be able to thoroughly check its body, its eyes, its cloaca, and even its mouth. But if you never handle it because it doesn't come to you, if the snake isn't used to you or fears your touch, life's going to get harder for both of you if and when there's a health issue to address. And the bottom line, you may not recognize the problem until it's too late to come back from. Isn't it worth it to spend time socializing the snake, even if it causes some short-term stress in the beginning, in order to avoid a situation where your animal suffers severely or even dies? Personally, and this is my personal opinion, so take it or leave it, I think it's our responsibility to handle our snakes regularly enough that they're not scared for their life in the case that we have to handle them. This is why I spend time building trust as much as possible, but I still take them out even if they don't come to me. I touch them first before picking them up so they know it's me. I get them used to being touched on the heads without me forcefully having to hold them down. I touch every part of their bodies so they're used to it. And I can tell you with confidence that with the exception of Alora, because she's still a tiny baby and we're still working on it, every other snake I have does not fear me. Even if they didn't come out on their own, they're not fearing for their lives when I pick them up, because they've learned that I'm not going to hurt them. I spent a long time not handling Hobbs because he didn't seem very comfortable when I did it. And guess what? I did a welfare check on him after a couple of months and realized he had a small kink in his tail and had gotten a bit overweight. I have no idea when or how the kink happened, but I do know that because I didn't handle him much, I didn't notice his weight gain as early as I should have. Obesity is not good for any snake, but especially not for his species. But the thing is, even Hobbs doesn't fear me. He comes to investigate me willingly. He never bites or acts defensively, but he doesn't choose to be handled. So even if he does his little nervous head bob when I'm holding him, I still handle him more regularly now because his life is in my hands. A little short-term stress during handling is way less likely to cause him long-term harm than obesity or belatedly noticing an illness that requires me to rush him to the vet. One more and then I'm done, I promise. If one of your animals gets mites or a contagious disease, but you didn't notice because you never handle them so you can look closely at their bodies, guess who else is going to get mites and disease? All of your other reptiles. And for those of us with quite a few animals, that's a literal nightmare. Honestly, that one just gives me hives just thinking about. And I only have 9 snakes. Some people have like 30 or more. No mites. So where do I stand? Find the balance. Choice-based interactions are the best route more often than not. If you watch my last video on trust building techniques, you'll know that I recommend a lot of patience and gentility when working with them. I advocate respecting their boundaries and paying attention to their body language, which are all aspects of choice-based methodology. But for me personally, I seek the balance between giving them complete control and having control myself. As long as I have the snake's welfare as the first priority and I'm paying attention to what they communicate, then I feel okay about choosing for them some of the time. I offer my hand every day just to show my presence, and sometimes that's all it is. For me, even if I don't end up actually handling them, just that interaction is soothing and rewarding. But I don't have the kind of time nor home environment where I can leave their enclosures open for long periods without being 100% present. And if I have a 30-minute window to do an enclosure clean, then I'm going to do it, whether they want to come out or not. Because I feel like that brief forced interaction is better than letting their enclosures be unsanitary. And yep, sometimes I just take them out because I want to. I acknowledge that I am choosing for them in that situation, but I know in my heart that I'm not doing them harm, because this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this. These are not animals showing signs of stress. Some people have expressed concern about the fact that I take my snakes on therapy visits with the little zoo, and that this seems like an unnecessary, forceful, and stressful interaction. Now, most certainly it's not their choice to go on these visits, but I don't just take any or all of them with me. The animals that go on these visits have been socialized by me already, and each time before we go, I take a moment to thoughtfully judge who seems up for it that day, or whose temperament is appropriate for interaction with the type of people we will be working with. And I feel confident that I know my animals well enough to judge wisely and responsibly. When I let strangers handle my snakes, I watch them like hawks. And if I see any signs of stress, I put the snake away. In the years of doing this with them, it's happened all of 2 or 3 times, and I'm extremely sensitive to it. After a trip with the little zoo, I don't handle those animals myself for at least a day or 2, unless they choose it, in order to ensure they don't retain long-term stress. I would never encourage forceful handling that caused harm to a snake. I would never recommend handling your snakes more than they're comfortable with without reason. But how do you get them comfortable with it? You handle them. You show them you're not a threat and that they have nothing to fear from you. And their trust is a gift. It's what inspired me to make this channel. It's a gift that soothes my soul and brings so many other people joy who would otherwise not have the opportunity to experience it. I hope that you get to experience it too, but you should make up your own mind. As long as the animal's overall welfare is at the forefront of your mind, then I think you're probably making the right choice, regardless. Thanks for watching. I'm Shira, and this is Helios, and we'll see you next time for more snake therapy.